1. Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, for many decades, the African continent has wanted to become more economically independent. They wanted to bolster a sense of a Pan-African identity in order to make them stronger and more resilient against the volatility and shocks happening all around the world. An example of this is ECOWAS with the Economic Community of West African States in a general trend and shift towards regional interdependence in order to be independent from external world powers. The path to victory of closing opposition is going to be very simple. We're going to prove to you how we backtrack the progress we've already made and ultimately make things worse when you shift the economic priority to having to trade with these sketchy countries who I think, as I raised in my POIs, probably don't have the means, motivation, or incentive to trade with us fairly. And I am going to prove the counterfactual or comparative on our side, how Africa's going to be able to reach that interdependence that opening government wants to be able to talk about. My first strategic observation of top half clash is that they're largely assertive and outcome dependent. Side proposition is assertive that these sanction states have the capacity to be able to trade well. But like what I mentioned in my point of information, right? If you just gut check this, a lot of the Venezuelan oil fields and petrol depots were literally annexed by the United States, meaning the supply of oil is no longer with Venezuela, it's with the United States. That is to say, if you try and continue to be able to trade with them and solely them, they're probably going to assume that you have some allegiance or tie to Maduro and are less likely to be able to give you that cheap black gold or that cheap petrol at more attractive prices. And if you take a look at the currencies, if you take a look at the financial markets, and if you take a look at the economy of majority of these sanctioned states, you essentially at worst see a lot of inflation or at best stagflation. Because what happens is that there's an economic retaliation from those sanctioned states, whether that be Syria, China, Iran, Venezuela. It's not necessarily good for Africa to be able to meddle there. I understand this isn't an actor motion, it's a value judgment. But we also have to understand that the African continent doesn't exist on one kind of dimension. It exists in a spectrum. And I think both opening teams think that they're so resilient, like South Africa, because they have the best GDP per capita, to be able to withstand this particular retaliation. And I think opening opposition to an extent also assumes the US wants to be able to retaliate in that way. But I think, and here's the kicker, even if there's no retaliation, it's just better that Africa doesn't put themselves in a situation for that to possibly happen. So, side proposition's case only works if they have the best capacity economically to give us all of these good trades and all of these good kinds of transactions. Opening opposition harm is contingent on retaliation. But what Matthew and I are going to tell you is very simple. We're going to say that regardless of them being retaliation or not, and even if these countries, despite having sanctions, can still trade, it's just not within the spirit of what Africa should do, given the precursor and given the presupposition of wanting to be independent in the first place. This is where we flip the principle of Deputy Prime Minister, because DPM talks about wanting to be able to promote a strong Africa, and I think Member echoes this when they talk about wanting to be able to be consistent with fighting America and all of these things. Why do we have to play that game? Their priority is economics. We don't need to muddle that economic strategy with a political kind of problem. More than putting a back or a target on yourself, what's likely to happen is that you spread your resources too thinly. Because something top half forgets is that on both sides of this debate, we can still trade with these sanctioned countries. It's a fair burden and call out on opposition to say, bro, we just don't want to be able to significantly trade more with them. Because I agree, right? China to a large extent invests in Africa. So what will skewing economic priority to try and get more money from them? I think it's better that we don't double down on those risks. And even if those risks don't happen, it's just not worthwhile that particular outcome. Because on our comparative, it's more likely that if we don't align ourselves with another power, and that's another flip of proposition, if they don't want to be at the mercy of the US, then shifting that priority to Kuwait or China or Venezuela shifts that power dynamic for the African nation to them, which is something we don't want China to get away with given the history of the CCP being potentially shady and given their history of predatory debt practices and lending being central to China. So what have we proved to you so far? The call out is simple. I understand the case of opening opposition, and it's correct that insurance premiums will go up. It's correct that commodity prices and currency prices are shady, but they missed the comparative. The comparative is that when you have strategic ambiguity and you have a more independent economic policy, regardless of retaliation, we're able to unlock the benefits that Prime Minister posited in this debate. We agree. The African continent does not exist in a spectrum. Not everyone is South Africa. And you have a lot of poorer nation states like that of Mozambique, etc., who ultimately cannot withstand that particular shock, and they don't necessarily want to put their economic or independent policy in the hands of an externality. That is to say, even if you don't have retaliation, you aren't necessarily able to reap the benefits of a more unified Africa, absent the ability of them to be able to take things into their own hands and not necessarily skew it to any world power, regardless of retaliation. Very proud to stand on side opposition.